Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the People's Perspective on Development with your host, me, Tunisia Kasim. I'm so great to actually have this opportunity to speak to you about a topic and get your perspective on the development, design, thoughts, and understanding of public space. Yes, on today's episode, we're taking it back to the people and having discussions around the spaces and places that you use on a daily basis, and just to get your input on how we can improve, how can we change, what we can do better at. The topics for the people's perspective on development today is firstly, what is public space, what is public life, and what is the relationship between the two. Thereafter, that once we have a good understanding of these concepts and we have a greater clarity on how to use these terms, because as you know, as planners we have a lot of jargon, so I'm gonna spice up your vocab a bit, and then we're gonna take it back to what is the relationship, and then the discussion on public spaces in South Africa. With that being said, I think what's important is that there are very different understandings of what public space actually is. And today, I want to just have a look at the few on the screen that I got to research, and I think that it does cover the core principle behind what is public space. And we're going to start with firstly, public space is about accessibility to all citizens regardless of their income and their circumstances. Where do they come from, and where they live, their economic background, and so forth. And that's the epitome of public space, is that it comes in many forms. Natural spaces such as parks and beaches. We've got built up spaces such as squares, public transport interchanges, libraries. And ideally, today's discussion and episode is about people centered development. And that is the importance of public space. It's the notion that public space is created, designed, developed, and prepared for the people of the country, the people of the communities that it serves, as well as the people that are passing through and from. More than that, we need to have spaces that do promote social interaction, social cohesion, and bring about activity and life and vibrancy for people to interact with in their spaces. Before we move forward, I think it's important that um, we have a look at the characteristics of public space. And what's very important here, firstly, is these are dynamic spaces that fit the needs of their surrounding community. So it's very relevant to the community it is meant to serve, the location, the design, and the preparation for the activities that need to take place on these spaces. Ultimately, it needs to contribute to a harmonious, a sense of oneness in communities, and bring a sense of liveliness, vibrancy, and integrate different elements that come from the input of local residents, guys. And I think that's what's very important here, is that you need to ensure that there is input from local residents on the design and how they want to transform their public spaces. Before we move forward, I just want to give two key pointers that's very important for the design and management of public space, and what does it contribute to these communities. Public space builds a sense of community, in a sense that it's a platform, a physical space where communities can share similar interests. They are vibrant and they're attractive for people to want to come out of their houses and engage in these spaces. More than that, parks and recreation spaces, these green spaces, are also very beneficial to the overall mental and emotional well being, for joy, for health, for breathing grounds, just to take a moment for people to have an outlook and a space to think on. Public space also makes cities safer. I'm going to take a great reference from Jane Jacobs, who stipulates that neighborhoods were safer when there were eyes on the street. There's safety in the aspect of being outside in public spaces, and we get to see what happens. And unfortunately, now we have either very vacant parks, vacant public spaces, or very high rise buildings that shadow our public spaces. And as a result, we've lost eyes on the street. And the question here is, how can these public spaces, be redesigned and relooked at to bring back public safety and the shared use of space? Now that we understand the physical context of what public space is, I would like for us to unpack what takes place in these spaces. And that is where we get to public life. Public life was coined by a brilliant author who we're actually going to unpack one of his books on how to study public life in episode 2 and 3. And we're going to use the tools furthermore as we engage with professionals and academics. I've got such a jam-packed podcast lined up for you guys. I'm really excited to have your input. Um, public life. Public life is when we come together to form a sense of community that is associated with a shared space. It's a sensory experience between people, noise, smell, sound, visual representation. How do people feel? How do people receive the space? How do people experience the spaces that they're in? Whether they are pedestrians, whether they are driving in their own privatized vehicles, or they're on public transport. Public life is where you and I exist on a daily basis before we get to work, before we get home. It's life in between the spaces. What is the relationship between these two? I'd love to hear your inputs, your thoughts, and ideas now that you understand public life and public space. Where I feel that they meet is that when we receive input from public life, the users who interact in the spaces, in these public spaces, we're able to design and create place made for specific use to serve the community as it's needed. Places and spaces that are inclusive, that are democratic, that are welcoming and accessible to any race, income group, regardless of where you live and the circumstances you are from. But you are able to engage, interact, and experience and enjoy public space without the expense, without the cost, and feeling safe. Now that we understand the relationship, what's very important is to bring it back to the South African context. As we know previously with South Africa's history, is that the planning policy previously had two objectives. Firstly, the legacy of apartheid was a time of separation, a time of segregation, where we had separate races relocated, and unfortunately, public spaces were often weaponized in these areas where the limited access people had was dependent on their race. More than that, 20 years on, we still have to consider how do we make these spaces more accessible. As we move forward in the episodes to come, I really want us to take a moment and I want to leave you with thoughts that need to be unpacked is how do we reclaim public space for the people in our country, for the people in our communities? What elements of the criteria that we're going to be discussing for successful public spaces are we missing? More than that, what should we be doing more of for public space and for public life to integrate harmoniously? I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear your comments. Please leave just your thoughts with us. As we move forward in this session, in the episodes to come, I want to have a moment where I can just inspire you. These are four great books of many books that have inspired me on my quest and study of public life and public space. As we move on to episode 2, we're going to focus precisely on how to study public life by Jan Gehl, who is a great author and gave us a set of tools, a set of steps and processes on how to study public life. And we're going to bring it back to the South African context. We're going to look at case studies. We're going to look at international examples. And we would love to engage with you on how you think we can improve communities in your areas. And I can't wait to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for joining me. I cannot wait to hear the people's perspective on development and your take on public life versus public space. Leave your comments below. Super excited to hear from you and cannot wait to get into episode 2.